вас открытие. Весь мир знает.
The Cold War was an era like no other. It was a time when men and women around the globe were afraid every day of their destruction. It was an era where, in minutes, the world could go from peace to utter destruction and death. An era where one country could be 8,000 miles from another and be worried about decimation. All of this because of nuclear weapons.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
In 1945, when American President Harry Truman gave the orders to drop an atomic bomb on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he didn't know that his decision would bring about a new age of civilization. The bombs that killed over 200,000 people sparked an arms race that would last almost 50 years and see the two most powerful nations in the world come so close to nuclear war countless times. Just 4 years after the first atomic bomb was dropped by the United States and Japan, the Russian Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, dropped their first bomb, faster than many analysts predicted they would. This day started decades of constant anxiety and fear and forced both countries into a conflict without battle. However, less than 1 year later, North Korea would invade South Korea with support from the Soviet government. This put America in a position in which they had to support the South Koreans, and thus starting the first time that global nuclear war could occur.
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy.
In 1953, after 3 years of fighting in Korea and no outcome was in sight, newly inaugurated President Dwight D. Eisenhower threatened to use nuclear weapons and ended the conflict. Just 4 months earlier, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had died and forced the Russians to withdraw support from the North Koreans to handle the problem of succession. Things only continued to escalate, though, when on October 1st, 1957, the Strategic Air Command initiated 24/7 nuclear alert in order to be ready for any nuclear attack. Just 4 days later, Russia would launch Sputnik, the first satellite to be launched in space, and this worried the American government, for they feared of spying by the Soviets. Just 4 months after the launch of Sputnik, the United States satellite Explorer 1 was launched into space, and thus starting the space race, which lasted until America put the first man on the moon in 1969.
Revolucionarios cubanos, nuestro deber internacionalista. Así entiende nuestro pueblo sus deberes, porque entiende que el enemigo es uno, el mismo que nos ataca a nosotros.
On January 1st, 1959, communist Fidel Castro overthrew the American-supported Cuban government and installed his own communist regime, which received support from Russia. Later that year, the Viet Cong were formed and vowed to overthrow the anti-communist South Korean government. After a year of diplomatic attempts by America to maintain friendly relations with Cuba, President Eisenhower, in his last days as president, severed all ties with the communist country, and just 2 weeks later, John F. Kennedy would become the President of the United States, an event which would change the whole Cold War altogether.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
On October 16, 1962, President Kennedy was informed that the Soviets had been building military bases which included nuclear armaments on Cuba. His response was to quarantine Cuba and thus raising tensions with the Soviet government. Just 1 year prior, Kennedy made the worst mistake of his political career when he decided to launch a military operation in Cuba involving 1,400 Cuban exiles. This operation was a massive failure and resulted in even higher tensions with both Cuba and Russian governments. This was known as the Bay of Pigs. After the quarantine of Cuba was established, Russian cargo ships approached the naval blockade and were instructed to turn back. They did not. Everyone feared that the American ships would be forced to fire upon the inbound Soviet ships and would then be the start of another world war. This is Landon Martin, a casual school student at Fleming Island High School. I've heard many stories from my grandparents of what it was like living during the early 60s. They were just little school children at the time, and when I asked them about the Cuban Missile Crisis, they told me that while they were at school, their teachers had the radio tuned in to the event. She said there was an aura of fear around the whole class. My grandma said there were older students crying because this wasn't an event that they had power over. This wasn't an event that took place over months or years that they could keep track of over time. She said that in 5 minutes war could break out and there was nothing that anyone could do about it in the classroom. And she said that made them very afraid, very fearful, not only for their lives, but the lives of their loved ones and their friends, that their whole life would be completely changed during this event. Fortunately, President Kennedy's play to not move his ships and calling on the bluff of the Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev paid off, and at the last minute the cargo ships were ordered to turn around and head home. The missile crisis had been diffused, and an agreement between the two leaders was made. Russia would pull all missiles from Cuba if the United States did the same for nearby Turkey and Italy. Just 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. His assassination caused many problems with the Soviet government, for they thought that due to Kennedy's young age, he wouldn't be a major problem to their goals. In 1961, to combat the problem of escaping East Germans, the communist regime built a wall that separated the countries of East and West Germany. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, and the decades after, tensions continued to arise between the Russians and the Americans, with a few notable events occurring, one of which was a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which was open for signing in July of 1969. This treaty's objective was to stop the spread of nuclear weapons across the globe.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability,
And will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States, an event which would lead to the downfall of the USSR. During his first term, President Reagan did many great things, like putting pressure on the Russians and revolutionizing American institutions. In his second term, Reagan gave the greatest speech of his career, in which he stated in West Germany this:
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Over the next 4 years, tensions between the Americans and the Russians lowered, treaties were signed, and troops were recalled from conflict. In 1990, the East German government officially announced that it would be demolishing the Berlin Wall, an act in which Reagan is heavily credited for. In 1991, the Soviet Union's flag, the hammer and sickle, was lowered for the last time, replaced with the flag of the Russian Republic, declaring the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War.